I'm Tom Izu. I am on the advisory board of the Japanese American Museum of San Jose, and I'm also the director of the California History Center at the Anza College. And we have a project there called the Audrey and Butcher Civil Liberties Education Initiative, and you'll see what it has to do with this program soon, I think. Let's see, I just wanted first to welcome all of you, and I really thank all of you for coming out here. For how many of you is it the first time you've been to the museum? Pretty good, pretty good. So if you haven't had a chance, later you'll have the opportunity to go down and see the gallery, and we have a number of volunteers here who can talk to you about the museum and learn more about it. We're really thrilled to have some new faces here. An executive order. And all of you know what an executive order. I might tell this to students. And years ago, they said, I don't know, what are you talking about? I don't know what you're talking about. But now their ears and their eyes open. So he signed an executive order 9066. And that led to the mass expulsion and ultimately the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans from the West Coast into concentration camps throughout the United States. On the date, February 19th, or close as we can, most of the Japanese American communities, starting in the 1970s, started observing the day through something called the Day of Remembrance. And I'll make a little announcement about this later, but the big San Jose one is coming up on Sunday. Now I'm going to be more academic. So this is the facts, as I mentioned. And this is where I am now. So on the Day of Remembrance, Japanese Americans make a pledge to make sure something like what happened to our community doesn't happen to anybody else. And that's a really important thing to me personally. Oops. Another thing that we do on Day of Remembrance, which is a tradition, is to have a chance to hear from the people who actually experienced this and endured this, so that we can show our respect to them and honor their memory. And actually in this audience, we have a number of people who actually were former internees. If you could raise your hands, those of you who were in one of the camps, the communities, and they're members of those communities as well. So in following that tradition, I'm going to show a short video because I'm not going to make these people stand up and talk. I used to do that all the time.
My parents, upon leaving, they lost their restaurant. That was their livelihood. I saw my father cry because for 20 years he worked so hard, it just took everything out of him.
They told us you could have one suitcase.
We first went to what was called an assembly center.
There was 4 of us in this one horse's stall.
This is our family number that we are assigned to. We have to keep it on our clothing. We had to wear this wherever we went, especially when we were assigned to different places.
We got on a train and they had all the blinds closed. We couldn't open it up, and we ended up in Utah and they assigned us barracks.
There were these guard towers where sentries were stationed with their firearms.
My brother was in the army. He was fighting over there in Italy, in southern France. And his mother and father and his younger son is in a camp.
So when I got into high school, I felt very strongly of assimilation, and so I joined the Junior Statesman's Club, the German Club, the high school band, and the a cappella choir.
I did feel I had to prove my Americanness. I wanted to just blend into the woodwork and not make any waves or anything.
When the Korean War started in 1950, I enlisted in the U.S. Army and served my 3 years to prove my loyalty.
I don't think I ever felt that I should prove my American feelings of loyalty. I was born an American, and I was everything that I read and studied and learned was that I was an American.
Well, right now they're talking about Muslims. They don't want Muslim to come in, you know. But I don't think that's right.
What's happening to the Muslims right now is it's really close to the hearts of the Japanese Americans because it happened to us.
Especially during a crisis, people forget the Constitution and what it guarantees for everyone. And so we have to be on guard constantly. Otherwise, some of these people will take over and make it difficult for certain people.
Order basically made people like my grandparents and my parents suddenly illegal for them to actually just be physically in the West Coast. It made it illegal for them to go to their jobs. My grandmother cleaned houses. My grandfather worked in the fields, Santa Clara Valley. It made it illegal for my own parents to be able to go to the schools that many of them had been going to since they were children. And it also, the only requirement was that they be 1/16th Japanese ancestry. That was the only requirement that made them become enemies of the state, dangers to national security. So if you given that history, and this is a fact, and then given the voices that you heard and some of the people here you can talk to me it's really shocking that anybody, including somebody in the Trump administration, would claim that the internment of Japanese Americans can be used as a precedent and can be used to justify doing something like this similar to other people. I think you've heard this in interviews where they said, well, Roosevelt did it, so I'm not saying exactly we should do it like that, but he did do it. And so you know what they're trying to say. But to me it's shocking that because it's been so criticized and repudiated completely. The English instructor said I shouldn't say repudiated completely. It was just repudiated. So, so for example, scholars, historians, constitutional experts have all said, yes, it was definitely wrong and in violation of our Constitution and Bill of Rights. A federal commission also found this to be the case, and they said Japanese Americans should be paid redress for this. The United States Congress voted for and passed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which did provide redress for Japanese Americans. And President Reagan signed it. And several presidents after him wrote apology letters to people like my parents, if they were still alive. So you see that there's no basis for justifying the Japanese American internment anymore. And that's one thing in this Day of Remembrance. We want to make it clear to everybody out there in the community that we want, the people who helped start Day of Remembrances, we want it to be used as a precedent against doing this. We want it to be used as a precedent so that people really think more critically. When people start talking about doing something similar like this, when people start using hate and fear to govern policy, that they stop and think, is this really the right thing to do? So, you might be wondering, why did I do this program? I have Japanese Americans, I have Mexican Americans, you know, I like Mexican food, and I know lots of Mexican American friends of mine like Japanese food. I noticed there's some strange similarities, by the way, but that's not why I wanted to do it. The reason I wanted to do it was because I think there's a clear pattern that has affected a lot of us. A lot of times people think the Japanese American internment happened overnight, that suddenly after the attack on Pearl Harbor, everybody freaked out, and it was just unavoidable. That's just the way humans are. They get scared. But if you know a little bit of history, you know there's a pattern here. Like when the Chinese first came to this country, They were desperately needed for their labor, and they were exploited for it, and people made a lot of money off of them, but at the same time, they became convenient scapegoats for certain other people for economic, political reason to rise to power, using them as a dangerous enemy that they'll be saved from. And when they did finally pass the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, they needed another group of laborers, and those were the Japanese who came. And I just want to show a few slides here. This is in the 1920s. There's a famous man, James Phelan, who was the mayor of San Francisco and also a senator of California. And one of his big claims to fame was that he would protect us from the Japanese hordes. I say we, you know what I mean. And I found this photo from a Sacramento Union newspaper in 1920, and you may not be able to read it, but James Phelan there, it looks like he's built a wall, and it says, "California shall not be given over to the Mongolians." And so a little explanation, that's what they called Asians, and at this time he's definitely talking about the Japanese. And there's a little donkey in the corner here, and the donkey is saying, "Phelan is the one we can depend on. He's going to protect us." So I'm not trying to make any parallels to today, but you could figure it out. So the point is given this history, it should help us understand the commonalities we have between, especially the immigrant communities and what we face. And I think in Day of Remembrance, this is a time to really make those connections and not keep our views so separate from each other and find our own commonalities through the history. And what I'd like to say is that after the Japanese came and people like Phelan became famous going after them, they passed another immigration law called Immigration Law of 1924. And that's basically ceased immigration from Japan. So they still needed somebody else, so who did they turn to? In the 1930s, it was Mexican Americans, and they became the next labor force and the next group of people to go after. And